Hey, welcome everyone. I am Dr. Kim,
And I'm Dr. Burris.
and we are from Coachella Valley Direct Primary Care. And Coachella Valley Direct Primary Care, we help busy families in the Coachella Valley obtain optimal health so they can enjoy the life they desire. And today we are doing our COVID-19 show where we update how things are in the valley specifically, but this could also apply to areas that are near here. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Burris?
I'm doing great. I'm having a good day so far.
Yes, the weather's turned well.
Yeah.
So, today we're going to talk about some numbers and some surprises in the numbers. And we're going to continue our talk on grief. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're going to cover what's been going on in the valley, and then we're also going to um, continue what we started last week, which was talking about the signs and the experiences that people have with different kinds of loss. And also, today we're going to get to the part where we talk about how to manage those and how to kind of help heal.
Okay. Um, shall we get into the numbers then?
Sure. So, our first slide here is from last Friday's daily report. And really, what's exciting to me is that if you look at the cumulative COVID cases, you'll see that latest sort of mountain or hill there is still coming down and almost back down to our baseline. And so on the left, what you see is the big surge that we had last winter, and then this lower peak is what happened with the Delta variant. And I wanted to stop here and take a moment, because if we had not vaccinated as many people as we had, if we had not gotten the vaccines out throughout our elderly populations, these numbers would have been higher than last winter. We would have looked more like the states that had lower vaccine coverage rates, where their winter surge was eclipsed by the Delta surge. And so I just want us to recognize that that was an accomplishment. We didn't completely dodge the bullet, but it grazed us instead of hitting a center mass, is basically what happened. And even though we lost about, honestly, about another 100 people in the Coachella Valley over this Delta variant time, it could have been another 1,000. So that is why we sort of come back to vaccines and are still trying to reach out to a lot of our friends and neighbors who maybe haven't quite gotten their vaccine yet for a variety of reasons, and trying to help them understand the benefit of it, but also address people's concerns. Because if we had, say, 85 to 90% of our population vaccinated, we wouldn't have had a Delta surge at all, and we wouldn't have lost those 100 people in the valley over the last couple months.
Well, to be fair, maybe some of them, because they're breakthrough
That's
cases.
true. And there are always going to be people who are so vulnerable and so fragile that even a small illness could kill them.
But it would have been still a fraction
handful.
of right.
Right. So that is sort of the big picture, 10,000 foot view of what's going on in the valley.
Right. And I think that is a tough conversation that you should be having with your provider. Right. It's not a, go to Dr. Google or go to, I think it's something that you should talk to your doctor about. Don't you agree?
I do. And I think I want to touch on boosters too, because there's a couple updates there. Let's go actually down to the bottom of this slide. And what you'll see here is, again, this incrementally slowly decreasing positivity rate. So we're like 5.8, 5.7, 5.7. And basically, what you'll see is this continued very slow decrease here. I don't know why we're on this really, really not. I mean, it's this just
This
like
plateau, I guess.
gradual
Yeah.
slope instead of the faster slope down that we saw last time. But this appears to be what this particular surge is doing.
Well, I think it's because the more it goes down, the more we open up, and so
Right. So we're still seeing significant transmission
right.
because of the fact that we don't have as many mitigation factors in place. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. This is our Coachella Valley weekly report. And what you'll see here is that we follow the trends of the rest of the valley. Our hospitalizations are just sort of kind of like slowly trending down again, following that slow curve downward. Um, and then let's go down to the bottom. So what you'll see here again is our fully vaccinated rates are incrementally inching up. We've definitely hit what I would call a mud puddle or something, where the rate at which we're actually vaccinating people is pretty slow. And what we're getting now in our vaccination clinics is primarily people coming in for boosters rather than being able to reach into the population that is still unvaccinated. Okay, so let's take a break for a second and talk about the booster shots. Because this Thursday, I think it's this Thursday, they are meeting to discuss booster shots at the FDA for Moderna and Johnson and Johnson. Because right now they're only recommended for people who receive the Pfizer vaccine, and we've been telling Moderna and Johnson people, hang on, it's coming.
Right.
So they've applied for that permission to do boosters, and they're meeting this week to discuss it. If they decide to recommend boosters, that then goes to the CDC committee. And we're becoming more familiar with this process now since we're watching it happen over and over and over. So FDA meets this week, and then if they send their recommendations to the CDC, then their committee will meet, and if they make the recommendation, then it will go out and be sort of like approved. So it requires both committees. Having said that, because they've applied for the EUA for Pfizer for the 5 to 11 age group, that committee at the FDA is meeting on October 26th. So theoretically, if they at that meeting vote to approve it, it would then go to the CDC advisory on immunization practice committee. That's called the ACIP. But that committee would theoretically be meeting in an expeditious manner, and we may have a recommendation, if there are no hiccups, by the end of October for children in that 5 to 11 age group for Pfizer vaccine. The recommendation that Pfizer has submitted is for a vaccination for that age group that is only 1/3 of the current dose that's used for adults. So that's sort of what's going on in the world of approvals and boosters and children. Moderna most likely will apply for their emergency use authorization for children with a larger group of children. Instead of doing the 12 to 18 and then the 5 to 11, it's anticipated they will do 5 to 18 all at the same time, which is why they're a little behind.
Right. And presumably they're going to have a higher standard of, for the lower age group for both Pfizer and Moderna of the data that they're going to look at, because
Yeah,
that's an age group there's a lot different than
correct.
adults.
And
So
the other thing to keep in mind is when they look at this data, they are weighing the risk benefit for this age group specifically. So we're talking about an age group that tends to have less severe COVID to begin with. So they're looking at, is this a benefit for this age group
right.
to do this? And so that's one reason why it can seem for some people like it's taking forever, because they really have to weigh that.
Right. And I know there's some pharmacies out there and some places that are actually mixing and matching, and that's not recommended in terms of booster.
Correct.
So you should only get the same shot that you got originally as a booster, at least currently.
Yeah. There are also ongoing studies right now that are going to be done fairly soon that look at the mixing of different vaccine types. So they're looking at Pfizer and then Moderna mixes, and Johnson & Johnson with Moderna or Pfizer. And so once that's actually given, we may get some additional recommendations on mixing types of vaccines. But currently, that's not FDA approved. So if somebody chooses to do that, they are outside of that recommendation.
So I know I wasn't going to ask you this, and so I'm blindsiding this, but what would you say? Does everyone get a booster, or who should get a booster? Or
so I actually have been thinking about this a lot, because as we've talked about, not everybody's risk is the same. And just because your antibody levels may be dropping doesn't mean that you're not protected.
Right.
So we all have the ability, if our immune systems are functional, to activate what are called memory cells. So when we see an infection that we were immunized for in the past, those memory cells wake up and start kicking out on an antibody. The problem is that takes a little time. It takes a couple days for your immune system to kind of get into gear. So what happens is that infection gets into you and starts to get you sick, but then your immune system kicks into gear and fights it off. And so you get a milder illness. So that's what's happening once things wane. So what we're looking at is there are people for whom that mild illness is still a big risk. And for them, they should absolutely get a booster shot, because that's going to protect them better against even mild illness. So in our high-risk population for COVID, that includes people 50 and over and people with underlying health conditions. So one of the things that I think we haven't done a good job educating people about is that underlying health conditions mean something different for COVID. So for COVID, underlying health condition could be a 30-year-old who's overweight, or a 45-year-old who has well-controlled hypertension. Normally, these are people who probably would think of themselves as pretty healthy, but for COVID, they're actually in a high-risk group. So helping people understand, hey, even though you're overall very healthy, you definitely are at higher risk. So maybe think about a booster for you. Or if you're in an age group where you're not at high risk, say you're a healthy 25-year-old, but you care for someone in your home who is high risk, say a child who has medical problems or an elderly person, you may not want to risk bringing home that mild or asymptomatic infection that could give them a mild infection, but because they have that risk factor, might be more serious.
Right.
Is that a long answer?
No, that was a short answer for you.
No, that's true. It's all relative, I guess.
Right. And I would also say that, I also think if you're out there and you're coming into contact with a lot of people, so, that's a broad category, but, frontline workers and police officers and firefighters, and just
And
because,
even pastors,
well, anyone,
people,
right?
yeah.
I'm not singling out one thing, but,
Yeah.
if you come into contact with a variety of group of people in your day in, day out, then probably getting a booster is going to help the overall, but also help you, because eventually it's like rolling the dice, and the chances are the same each time, but you don't want to keep rolling that dice. So
Right. And if you were recently vaccinated, you don't have to think about this yet. It has to be at least 6 months out.
Right.
And really, sometimes I think 6 to 12 months is a reasonable time period.
All right, so let's get to the grief, because I know you wanted to talk about that.
I do want to
We
talk
got
about
a little
it.
derailed. I'm sorry, it was my fault.
Well, no, I forgot about, we need to talk about this too. So grief, we started talking about last time. And we started talking about the physical symptoms, the emotional, the cognitive or mental things that can happen during grieving. And this is a slide that talks about how people do react during grief. And it's just to remind people that it encompasses a lot of different areas. And so things you may not realize are from grief could be things like just being a little more prone to getting ill. I see a lot of people who come in with things like shingles or things like bad bronchitis during periods of stress. And those periods of stress can include the grieving process. So remembering that. And then there are some behavioral reactions that people may find odd if they're doing them, or they know someone who's doing them. And this includes seeing dead people. I mean, this is not a reference to the sixth sense, but it is very, very common for people to see their loved one after they've died, either having like a full-on conversation with them or just seeing them across the room. This is what I would consider part of normal grieving, especially if it's not scary or intrusive. But it can be really disconcerting for people, or really, especially if it's not something that you've ever seen someone go through, it can be really freaky. So this is normal. Our brain and our heart are going through something. There are some people who will almost like memorialize that person, almost create a shrine to them. That also can be cultural. And so just sort of recognizing that all of these things are what we would consider part of a normal grieving process, up to a point. So at what point do you think that grieving gets to an area where we would call it abnormal grieving or depression? When what are the warning signs for that?
Well, I think, grief is something that we don't deal with as a culture very well. And there are some cultures, I think the Hispanic community, the Mexican community deals with it better. They have the Day of the Dead, they have all these things. Whereas, as a U.S. population, we really don't. That aside, I think there are a lot of physical and also mental health warnings. Certainly things that are at the extreme at the beginning are danger signs. So if someone has decided not to eat at all, that's not normal. Or if they're not drinking water, or if they are, like you said, having so many intrusive thoughts that they're seeing things and hearing things, and it's not just the person, it's other people. Those things can happen. So, but generally I tell people, that there's little d depression and big D depression. And little d depression is things like grief. They're part of it, right? Normal reaction to many different things. And so, 2-3 weeks, not uncommon for people to experience and move through phases. Not that grief will go away in that period of time, but people can start functioning a little bit better slowly, right? So it's not like, after 3 weeks, oh, I'm better, but they should be able to, move on with their life.
Or get dressed,
Right.
take shower, or like take care of
Right.
themselves.
Function.
Function.
If you start moving into this, it's 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, then I tell people you might be going into what's called big D depression, where it's more than just grieving. It's something that you should talk to your doctor about, and that's something your doctor should be able to handle. And so, that's something that's important.
So, what about long term feeling sad? Like, a lot of the stuff that we learned when we were in training was pretty much baloney. And I remember hearing someone say, oh, the grieving process should not take longer than 6 months. And after 6 months, everything should be back to normal. And if not, then somebody's depressed. So I, now recognize that, people don't read the manuals and say, okay, 6 months is here, I'm done. That's kind of ridiculous. But there are some times when you think, actually, I feel like I might need some help. I've gotten stuck and I'm not where I want to be, and enough time has gone by that I feel like I should be able to function better and I'm frustrated. So, if somebody is at that point, what can they do to help them sort of continue through the process?
I would say it probably depends on the degree of stuckness, right? So if you're, just wanting help to move through because things are a little bit harder, there are a lot of support groups out there. There's a lot of good books out there that you can work through. But if you're banging your head against certain areas of your life that you just can't get through, and there really are a problem, I do think seeing a therapist or talking to someone or going to a support group can help you move through those tough areas that are stuck. So all your other areas are moving okay, but the whole ball can't move because you're struggling with this one area. Then I think that's when you probably should seek out some sort of help.
I agree. And I also think that there's nothing wrong with going to a grief support group, even like 5 years later. Because sometimes what'll happen is the grieving process is not linear. It's not like, okay, check this box, do the next one, next one, next one. Sometimes you'll go into, say, survival mode during a period of stress and kind of put your grieving in a compartment. And then maybe down the road, it forces its way back into the front burner, or it like things slow down and you're sort of able to start experiencing some of these emotions, or they intrude. You say, why am I so angry, or why is this bothering me? And coming back to something later, sometimes people need help from therapists to figure out, okay, that's where this is coming from. Other times people know, and they're like, I'm still upset about this. And at that point, often a support group of other people who are going through that process can really help people sort of deal with those emotions. Because do I have another slide? Did I send you a picture of ways to help people, like, or yourself? Like, how do you get through grieving? How do you work through it? Because the end goal of grieving is not to be happy and not sad. That's not the end goal of grieving. And I think, when we talk about, okay, working through grieving, you think, when I get to the end of it, supposedly I'm happy now. But that's not really what happens. So when you educate yourself on your signs and symptoms of grief, then you start to recognize how it's actually affecting you. And it also can help you realize how severe your experience is. And then talking about it is also a really important step, because once you start to recognize it, you're going to need a way to kind of say, hey, I'm going through this. So the third thing that can help is actually intentionally taking care of yourself. Although this sounds weird, it's like one of the things you can do is just be kind to yourself. The same way you might be kind to somebody else who is suffering, is like, okay, I really enjoy um, wearing my favorite sweater. So I'm going to wear my favorite sweater every day. That's okay. You know, this is something that gives me comfort doing those things. Um, and then this also goes into self care as far as making sure that you have time to eat well, doing some exercise, even if it's just going for a walk, moving a little, avoiding things that like are harmful to your brain, like drinking a lot of alcohol. Um, Sometimes people will drink because it takes them out of their feeling of feeling sad or feeling lonely, but then it also afterwards tends to depress you more. So it's a vicious cycle with that one. And then allowing yourself time to heal. Again, we have these expectations that somehow, we're supposed to put on a happy face and just kind of move on and not bother anybody with our grief. Well, honestly, that's not healthy. Um, if you're gonna be sad for, you know, 2 to 3 years after a significant loss, most people are going to understand that if you're not up for going to a party the next year. So it takes a while. And giving yourself permission to do that and not forcing yourself constantly to deny the fact that you're going through this process um, actually helps you sort of heal faster.
Um, so you mentioned what the end goal of grief is. What would you say the end goal? It's not to like forget about the person. It's not to be really happy. What would you say the
Um, to me, the end goal of grieving is to be able to remember that person and have some joy in their memory.
Right.
So when I think about like the losses that I've had, I feel like I've made progress when I remember that person, and most of what I'm experiencing with that memory and is a happy sensation. So I'm looking back and I'm like, oh man, that was hilarious. I really miss that person, but man, I am enjoying remembering them. Now, some grief is complicated because losses are sometimes not all positive. Sometimes, there's complicated
no?
relationships,
Yeah.
right? So sometimes that's not going to be possible, but being able to think back on that person and have some peace and some come to terms in the point where it's not causing you tremendous pain every time you remember that person, I think is the
Right.
end goal of grieving. So it's become a part of you. Their memory has become a part of you. You've incorporated them into your life in a way that honors them, but still honors the fact that you're living your life
Right.
now.
So that was the extreme end of grief, and we also talked about how the pandemic has made little grief, little losses. So can't go to my movies. I can't go to to church. I couldn't go to concerts. I couldn't do these things, and that's grieving, right?
Yeah.
Couldn't go to school for a whole year.
My kid missed their prom.
Right.
My kid missed their graduation.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, those were unfortunate, but I think if we all can learn to move through these processes, even in these little things, when they get to the complicated ones where you do lose a parent or a child or something, you're at least able to help yourself move through those stages better.
Right. Right. And I do think intentionally using these experiences that our children have had to help teach them how to um, honor a loss and also move through it and then look forward. Right. So if a child has had a loss in their life, whether it's a person or an event or a hope or something, this is an opportunity to help prepare them for the rest of their life.
Right. And to sum it up, grief has certain thoughts, and grief has certain feelings, and grief has certain symptoms and behaviors. And it's important to recognize those things, because if you don't, like you said, you're not going to understand, why am I so angry, or what happened here? Whoa, what did that,
Why do I feel like my heart is racing?
Right.
Why do I feel tired all the time? Right. Yeah.
And so that's something that you should definitely be able to talk to your provider. And that's one of the things that, wouldn't you say, why we switched to direct primary care, is because we can do that. We've done that. I've done that with our patients. And so it's important for you to find someone, a provider that can do that, because we're not, some of us aren't, mental health providers, but we all have certain trainings, but we can recognize the signs and symptoms of things when they get out of whack and when they're just kind of the normal.
Right. And help support people through the process, help them recognize physical signs or emotional signs of their own grieving processes, and help them manage them, because sometimes that requires medicine and sometimes it doesn't.
Right. So take home points today?
We're slowly still coming down. It looks like we're going into the holidays on a downward slope, but our vaccination rates are really stalled.
Yeah. Boosters are there, and we think in the next month or two, all of them will be boosterized, if that's a word.
It is now.
And including first shots for children.
5 to 11.
And grief, if you think you're experiencing grief, or your life is just topsy-turvy, consider maybe that you are going through a process of grief. It doesn't have to be a loss of someone. So talk to your provider. If you don't have a provider, there's you can always call our office. We have free consultations, not for that, but for becoming a member of our clinic, where we can help you feel better. So I think that's all we have for our COVID show, right?
Yep.
So if you want, please stay tuned. We have a show that's coming up about your personal health, and we'll be talking about sleep, right? We have this sleep month. We appreciate you guys joining this. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section, even if it's after the show. And if you like the show, or you think someone could benefit, please share it with people. And if you benefited, give us some likes and hearts, because that helps us too. All right, everyone, we'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us.